So I'm Ty Edwards. We all know why you're here. Extra credit. What? What? Speaking of that, Izzy, can you raise your hand? Do you still have that sheet? If you're one of my students that's here. Oh, it's circling? Okay. Well, and I think Doug Harvey's students, if you're here, you can talk to me at the end. He said to let me know for writing stuff down. Andrea, I know, was doing something. I don't know. Find your teacher before you leave. Okay. Disruption, then disease. Do you want to say something, Farrell? Or do you want me to just? Okay. I'm here as part of the College Scholar Program. I'm a scholar, and I work at the college. Here we are. Yeah. Okay, so disruption, then disease, the falsehood of the virgin soil thesis, and Osage example. Okay, so this is a hodgepodge of numerous things I've written on this topic, including my book, right over there, which you can buy, and I'll write in it something really nice that hopefully doesn't include swear words, which is my goal for today. Okay, so disruption, then disease. We've got a couple of things to go through, so let me give you some examples. Back in 2015, you may know that Pope Francis came to the United States and sainted, canonized, a guy named Junipero Serra. He was famous for being a missionary to California Indians in the 1770s and beyond. And when Pope Francis decided to saint him and announced it, that prompted basically months of protests in California and other places, especially by indigenous people, native people, so-called American Indians, against this. So here you can see these are some of the protests, right? So you can see their banners: Natives' Lives Matter, no sainthood for Sarah, genocide equals sainthood, this will be important for us, Jesus forgave killers, he didn't make them saints. Okay, so the reason why people are saying these things is Sarah was a missionary at missions where natives died in overwhelming death rates. They were places of brutality, places of children separated from their parents, men separated from women, and the death rates were high, okay? Which is why indigenous people resent this effort. Okay, however, of course, not everyone agreed with this sentiment, namely the Catholic Church. But not only them, there were many scholars that also felt like this was an inflammatory claim and inaccurate. So there was a website, the Catholic Church had a website promoting Sarah's canonization, and again in the months leading up to the September canonization. And they had an FAQ section, which I thought was awesome, on their website. And one of the questions was, the native Californian population declined after contact with Europeans. Is Sarah responsible? Answer. During the mission era, most native Californians who died prematurely did so because of Europeans' diseases to which the Indians had no immunity. It is clear that the native population suffered losses, but it was not because of Father Sarah, who, if anything, probably ameliorated their situation. Rather, it was the spread of diseases which neither the Spaniards nor the Indians of the 18th century had the technology to address. It wasn't Father Sarah, it was germs. Oh, problem solved. All right, now that same month, Sarah is sainted in September 2015. That same month, September, in California, in a Sacramento State University classroom, and this might sound relevant to many of you, the following events took place. A debate in a Sacramento State University classroom garnered national news coverage in September 2015. Professor Maury Wiseman, in an introductory U.S. history course, was teaching about early colonization when he said, quote, "There were a large number of people on this continent when Europeans arrived. I don't like to use the term genocide because genocide is something that is done on purpose. But needless to say, European diseases primarily will wipe out Native American populations on the two continents." An indigenous student in the class, Chiatanaba Johnson, who's Navajo and Maidu, disagreed with the professor's dismissal of genocide, spent several days finding sources to back up her views, and presented them to the professor in the following class period. According to Johnson, the student, a heated debate ensued. The professor accused her of hijacking the class, dismissed the students, and told her she was expelled from the course. The university maintained that Johnson was never disenrolled, and an official investigation eventually concluded no wrongdoing on the part of the student or the professor. Now, there's a lot of things we could talk about with that series of events, but what I'm going to focus on is the real problem is that Professor Wiseman said it couldn't be genocide because it was disease. So supposedly, disease lacks intent, right? And the root of genocide claims is intent to destroy, right? So that was his argument. All right, so what Professor Wiseman was teaching his students is what many of you have probably learned, and I'm not going to look at our professors in the back, but that what many of you may teach, Uh-oh. It's the virgin soil thesis. Oh, no. What is that? Okay, let me tell you what it is. You probably know what it is. You just might not call it this. All right, so what is the virgin soil thesis? It goes like this, supposedly. Old world populations had experience with a variety of diseases contracted from their domesticated livestock. New world populations lacking domestic animals were thus virgin populations. And once exposed to these old world diseases, widespread infection and mortality ensued. These epidemics supposedly spread rampantly after 1492, often ahead of colonizers, killing upwards of 90% of indigenous Americans. Not only were natives immunologically defenseless, they were also socially inept at treating these new diseases. Though massive Indian depopulation was certainly tragic, it was in the end deemed an unavoidable biological accident. What or who was to blame? Old world germs. Professor Wiseman, by teaching it in this way, came to a predictable conclusion, right? Germs lack intent, so it can't be genocide. All right, what's the problem? That's not true. We have decades and volumes of scholarship, of which mine is a teeny tiny part, that disprove that disease worked in these ways. We know that the way disease actually worked was much more complicated. All right, fun. All right, so here is a much more accurate look at the list of events. Okay, so what really causes disease amongst indigenous people? Epidemics among American Indians were caused by the same forces of poverty, social stress, and environmental vulnerability that cause epidemics in all other times and places. European and Neo-European, meaning American, Canadian, colonization disrupted native social systems, undermined subsistence, reduced fertility, inflicted violence, and literally displaced communities. This compromised mental and physical health that then made native people vulnerable to disease. Indigenous people used a wide variety of strategies to limit mortality and maintain communities, which were in some cases successful, but in many cases sustained colonial disruptions inhibited population recovery. Because social forces and human agency enabled epidemics to decimate native communities, the question becomes, was this genocide? Okay, so was this genocide? All right, so we know epidemics are caused by colonization, and it's sort of cascading series of events. Colonization's disruptions, as you see there, compromise all kinds of health. Then natives are vulnerable to disease. Natives do things to try to address this. But if colonization goes on long enough, their traditional methods of recovery to disease, of which they have a lot of experience, may not work. Okay, so we have lots of evidence about this. I'm going to use my examples that come from the Osage, who lived in what is now Missouri and eventually in Kansas. And here's a great example. So the Osage, for example, had contact with colonizers beginning in the 1680s, and they have direct contact with colonizers from the 1720s on. And there's no evidence of epidemic death. In fact, they spend almost a century with no major population loss or major epidemics at all. Okay, so what's happening? Europeans don't just show up, tap their toe on a piece of ground, and wildfire diseases knock out people. 90% of people dead. Apocalypse. No, that's not what's happening. All right, so in terms of good health, Osage good health. So not only are they not dying of diseases, they actually expand their population and their power in this period. So let me tell you about this in the context of power. Women's fertility. So in Osage society in this period, they're having about 3 to 4 kids on average. And in Osage society, a woman would lactate typically for 2 or 3 years, breastfeed her children. And in Osage society, you did not have sexual intercourse while you're breastfeeding. So this ensured that all of your children are at least 2 to 3 years apart, right? You're spacing out your children in this way. The thing that's good about that is it allows for maternal health and child health to be pretty firmly established before another child is born, and that was part of the intent. I should say at this exact same time, American women are having 7 to 8 children on average. So the American population is going to be doubling, is about double, right? Its rate of growth of the Osage population. Okay, so population gender balance. Children. Amongst children, you have about half of children are boys and half of children are girls, right? Which makes sense for a child population. But even in this period, when you get to adults, many more women exist in the population than men. And that's because the pursuits and occupations of men are far more dangerous. Warfare, of course, being one of them. but also hunting is extremely physically demanding, and they're hunting at a scale that is sort of unbelievable. The Osage are called an empire in this period, so their volume of trade hunting is serious. They double or triple their time from before colonization, so this is a lot. And that requires a lot of physical exertion that's extremely difficult for male bodies, and so men will die in various pursuits, and women, for the most part, are dying from nothing but old age in this period, okay? So women are living longer and dying simply from time. So the Osage were subject to but few diseases, and those were generally simple and easily cured with a rich variety of remedies utilized by individuals and respected doctors, all right? So this is a time for the Osage of prosperity and good health. And it's not coincidental that those go together. However, they're living, marrying, and spending lots of time with colonizers, okay? So apparently Europeans don't just show up and people lay over dead. Just keep that in your mind. All right, so what changes? The United States is what changes. All right, so the Osage experience with colonization is with French and Spanish colonizers, okay? After the 1800s, their experience with colonization is with the United States. United States colonization, like the British colonies that precede them, is a different kind of colonialism, and it's called settler colonialism. Okay, so settler colonialism is a special kind of empire that intends to eliminate the indigenous population so that the empire's settlers can possess that land. Okay, that's what a settler empire does. They want their own citizens to possess the land. So natives better get out of the way. So how do you eliminate indigenous people? Well, there's numerous ways you can do this. You can just murder them, which is pretty obviously genocide. You can, Americans like to call it remove. I've got it crossed out here. You mean expelling a specific ethnic group from a geographical area? Oh, that's ethnic cleansing, right? That's what removal is. Americans like to call it removal, but it's ethnic cleansing. Or the other way you can eliminate people is culturally. So missionization and assimilation programs intend to eliminate indigenous culture so that people no longer identify as indigenous in a generation or two and their culture is effectively eliminated, right? And they supposedly melt into the pot that Americans like to believe they are, okay? So settler colonialism needs indigenous elimination. All right, so where the Osage live officially becomes part of the United States in the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson is president during that. I don't have a lot of love for Jefferson. If you'd like to talk to me about that afterwards, I can go into it. The Louisiana Purchase. Okay, so Jefferson is president when this happens. His goal for that land is it is a place to put the people that he and other Americans intend to cleanse from the eastern part of the continent. All right? So the Louisiana Purchase is the place to put unwanted indigenous people. Okay? That's the goal. And in so doing, when indigenous groups, as I start to mark here, who have already started moving west in some cases as refugees, because Americans are part of the reason why many Americans will support the American Revolution is to have increased access to indigenous land, all right? And because they want that access, natives have to move. So you already have refugees moving into native land like the Osage land, and that leads to more competition over natural resources. Once Jefferson officially acquires this and then implements American Indian policy for this purpose, native people are officially sent to move into Osage territory, the most notable being the Cherokee. The Cherokee were also highly populous and well-armed, as were the Osage. So if you put those two groups on a concentrated piece of land, the likely outcome will be war, right? Competition over the natural resources and the physical space in which they're confined. So the Cherokee are a great example of one native refugee group used as a proxy invading group toward another indigenous group, like the Osage. However, Jefferson's goal, like most Americans, was to put Americans on the Louisiana Purchase land. That's the purpose, right? A settler colonial empire needs the land for its citizens. And American settlers are already invading Osage land in 1807. They're already settling west of St. Louis, which was the westernmost non-native settlement at the time. Again, this is all in Jefferson's presidency. Okay, so this is happening in a pretty rapid period of time. And that settler invasion just increases. So the Osage experienced lots of American settler encroachment. They would have viewed it certainly as squatting. And then basically a few decades after that, you see the arrival of missionaries. And missionaries are there to culturally eliminate. Right? Their goal is to eliminate native culture. They want to separate children from parents. The Osage are not particularly interested in that, so Protestant missionaries will not be successful amongst them, but it certainly shows intent, right? The intent is cultural elimination. And by the time we get to 1825, the Osage are officially eliminated from Missouri. They are expelled from that space. Missouri, of course, gained statehood in 1821, so you have enough Americans living there at that point to fully control the territory and to pass laws that benefit themselves, right, which require native elimination from that state. And that's when they will be confined to Kansas. And shocking, in 1820s is when the epidemics start. What is going on? 1820s is when the epidemics start. All right, so let me read you how magical this was. Oh, wait, let me show you. There you go. All right, so the Osage had been in contact with Europeans since the late 17th century, but it was not until the 1820s that U.S. colonialism significantly undermined Osage survival by increasing both Native and American populations in the region, leading to land loss, competition for resources, while government agents and missionaries attempted to alter every aspect of Osage society. This produced stress. Stress increased susceptibility to disease, inconsistent access to food due to war and other environmental events contributed to malnutrition at various points, making the Osage vulnerable to infection. At the same time, epidemics inhibited hunting and farming, contributing to further malnutrition and vulnerability to disease. This combination of factors produced overall immunological weakness, allowing multiple illnesses to strike a community in quick succession, increasing mortality. Though surviving some viral diseases, such as smallpox, would facilitate lifelong immunity. You can only get that one once. You're welcome. Many other illnesses, like influenza or other bacterial and viral diseases, can repeatedly devastate a community. So we like to talk about smallpox. What we need to talk about is flu. Flu can kill you every year. Still. You're welcome. In Kansas, the Osage attempted to reestablish their long successful agricultural hunting and trading economy. However, they struggled to find permanent village sites suitable for farming. As a result, their transitory existence made it difficult for traders to reach them for the first 5 years after removal. And this compelled them to suffer a great deal for want of needed provisions. They eventually selected locations believed to be the most fertile soil on the entire reservation, allowing women to attempt farming for the rest of their time in Kansas. These attempts, though, will not be overwhelmingly successful. I'll tell you why in a minute. In the late 1820s, volatile weather, lack of permanent villages, and infrequent trade all compromised food provision and health, presenting opportunities for disease to spread. A dry winter in 25-26 was followed by flooding in the spring, a wet summer, and massive flooding in the fall. Missionaries estimate the Neosho River rose 15 to 20 feet in September, washing away fields and stored crops. In May 1826, influenza emerged, and by August, dysentery. In 27-28, smallpox attacked. The summer of 28 brought another crop-destroying drought, and influenza epidemics continued through the remainder of the decade. The Osage started settling permanently in their Kansas villages along the Neosho and Verdigris rivers in 1830, and for the next 15 years, diseases repeatedly struck. In 31-32, attacks of fevers, cholera, measles, combined with scurvy and a plains-wide smallpox epidemic. The terrible scourge made a great destruction of life among them, and in a few months almost decimated the nation, and so weakened survivors that they could not hunt. In response, the federal government used payments they were supposed to give to the Osage for their land to buy rations for the Osage, and provided smallpox vaccinations to roughly 1/3 of the nation in the late summer and early fall of 32. However, the vaccination effort was poorly planned and ill-timed. The doctor struggled to find enough vaccine matter and could not contact all the Osages because many were on their summer hunt. What a coincidence. It is important to note that federal officials never provided systematic or preventative vaccinations, nor were vaccinations ever provided to all of the Osage people. Massive flooding in 33 was followed by extreme heat and drought in 34 that coincided with a cholera outbreak that killed an estimated 300 to 400 people. More cholera outbreaks continued through the 1840s, often as a result of contact with Americans who are on those cool trails that we like to mark by the highway, right? And play on our Apple Oregon Trail game. What? Dated reference. The Osage died at higher rates from cholera than did other native groups in the same time because of their densely populated villages that sometimes had 1,000 residents in them, where individuals confined to a small geographical area were repeatedly exposed to illness-causing bacteria. On the Kansas reservation, the unprecedented in Osage history close proximity of Osage villages to one another limited their long-standing method of placing waste on the outskirts of the village. Starting in the 1830s, the outskirts of multiple villages overlapped, contributing to poor sanitation and disease virulence. All right, so that's a sum. Okay, so Osage in Kansas. Their experience in Kansas is confinement, right? They are confined to a Kansas piece of land, okay? They are confined there. So selecting town sites was hard. Osage women were farmers. They had farmed for thousands of years in what we would now call Missouri and other eastern locations. If you've ever been to southeastern Kansas, it does not look like eastern Missouri, all right? And it was way less hospitable for farming, even for Americans when they move in here. This is a difficult place to farm. So that's why it takes them 5 years to figure out which piece is maybe the best out of all these unfarmable pieces. Okay, so if farming isn't working very well, what do you do to survive? And if disease is plaguing you, as is happening with them, especially cholera, right, which is in the water, and if you don't physically leave, you're probably gonna keep re-getting it. So they start moving more. They start relying more and more on hunting and trade as the way they subsist. The nice thing about hunting and trade is not only is it a way to have food and trade for other foods, but it keeps you away from the people who intend to culturally eliminate you. So once they're in Kansas, another round of missionization emerges. The Catholics also will admit by the time we get to 1872 that they were unsuccessful at converting the Osage to Christianity, much like the Protestants before them. But the intent is still the same, right? The intent is cultural elimination. All right, but for the Osage in Kansas, what happened in Missouri is going to happen again in Kansas, only at a much faster pace. So beginning in the 1850s is when the settler invasion to Kansas begins. And a lot of that settler invasion starts on the Osage Reservation. There are going to be 3 counties that are illegally formed inside of the Osage Reservation while it is still their land. You have militias formed by these settlers in order to assault, harass, or murder the Osage who resist that. They, of course, will experience that as squatting. And then theft. So if you show up and the Osage women have planted their crops and they're fertile now and you're a hungry settler, yum. So we have settlers literally stealing Osage crops out of the fields. They let their livestock graze in those fields. Osage women built homes out of planks and woven mats, which were pretty nice, especially if your other choice was a sod house. So they steal Osage home building materials. In some cases, they move right in to Osage homes. And then theft. Stealing Osage horses in particular. They also steal timber off their land. But the theft of Osage horses will be so bad that in the 1860s, it's going to be 5 to 20 a day that settlers are stealing from the Osage. And the horses are a big part of their trade wealth. That's one of the ways they trade to get access to food. All right, so not coincidentally, do you think that this is going to be a deadly time? Is life disrupted? Of course. 1850s is the deadliest decade. Okay, the 1850s is the deadliest decade. So let's read about how well this went. Throughout the Kansas reservation period, federal policies and settler invasion produced stress and malnutrition that heightened Osage susceptibility to disease. Repeatedly delayed payments for land prevented the Osage from obtaining goods necessary for all manner of men's and women's work and for trade, which simultaneously then undermined subsistence and made them hungry. Combine this with poor weather, and in 1852, the result was measles, typhoid fever, whooping cough, and scurvy, killing at least 1,000 people. Drought, floods, grasshoppers, and the settler invasion contributed to malnutrition throughout the 1850s, enabling multiple waves of smallpox and other contagious disease to kill hundreds at a time. For example, in 1855, smallpox will kill an estimated 400 people. The challenges facing the Osage only worsened in the 1860s, leaving them starving and desperate. More droughts, floods, grasshoppers, and settlers kept devastating agriculture, perpetuating malnutrition and disease. Even in years with successful hunts, dietary reliance almost exclusively on meat led to scurvy, also a deadly killer. Sometimes horses were the only trade good the Osage could use to procure food, and with frequent settler theft, that safety net exchange item was also in rapid decline. All right, so needless to say, if you go back here, right, the last thing I have there is land loss. So if you have hundreds of Americans squatting on Osage land, you have those same settlers stealing their food and goods, and you have massive waves of epidemic disease, this is the moment when you say we want more land, right? This is the moment where natives are under duress and you use this to access more native land. And that's exactly what happens. So a couple of things to note. Osage population and land loss. Something you have to remember about Indigenous people. Who they are is where they are, right? Where they are is why they are a problem for Americans. Because Americans want their own citizens to have access to that land. So when Native people lose land, they will lose lives. These things go together. And Americans are aware of it because it goes on in every single quote-unquote removal example. So late 1700s, really sizable population. Even as late as 1820, still really sizable. And then you can see the massive drop, right? By 1850, there's only 8,000. A decade later, 3,500 people. And then in 1870, about the time that they are expelled from Kansas and confined to an Oklahoma reservation, about 3,000. All right, so this disruption is killing a lot of people. So what's killing them, right? If we go back to this. Oh, come back. Right, if we go back to that, what's killing people? Since contact with French traders beginning in the 1680s, the Osage had almost entirely avoided disease outbreaks. The arrival of Europeans did not produce immediate, inevitable, or extensive mortality because the Osage, like other indigenous groups, were not immunologically defenseless, virgin populations. Throughout the 18th century European colonization, the Osage remained powerful, populous, and fully in control of their physical and spiritual lives. Not until the actions of Euro-American colonizers disrupted every aspect of Osage life did the context for epidemic death and sustained population loss emerge. The Osage did not die of accidentally introduced virgin soil epidemics. They died because U.S. colonization, removal policies, reservation confinement, and assimilation programs severely and continuously undermined physical and spiritual health. Disease was the secondary killer. That's why it's disruption, then disease. So the question becomes, why are we still teaching this? Why are we still believing this? Why are we still defending saints with this system? Right? Why do we believe it? Some people have argued that we believe it because it has a powerful and promiscuous appeal. It provides an alternative to human-centric histories, something that shifts blame off Europeans and their descendants and onto morally neutral biological forces. Is that it? The very language we employ is revealing. Virgin Indians were helpless before the thrust of European pathogens. The sexual innuendo is explicit. Indigenous peoples are constructed as an inferior, dependent, sexualized, strange, and subordinate minority, which defines their position in non-native dominated society past and present. Virgin soil thesis is construed as documenting history. But in reality, does it tell us more about the predominantly non-native authors and teachers that propagate it? As historian James Merrill has concluded, we are all, in more ways than one, colonial historians. The words we use and the arguments we teach reflect the power of colonial hierarchies even today. For decades, virgin soil thesis has framed and thus limited our view. Have we, as that same historian argued, met the enemy and he is us? Chiatanaba Johnson, based on her experience in her Sacramento State University classroom, certainly seemed to answer in the affirmative. In an op-ed in the student newspaper, she wrote, "The truth about American Indian genocide has been covered up for far too long. For Native students such as myself, the truth is not something we are used to hearing in a classroom. We are told horror stories of the days of the genocide not from professors, but from our parents and elders." Virgin soil thesis has proved an intellectual barrier for many in accepting that genocide occurred in the Americas. But thanks to decades and volumes of scholarship, that old stumbling block is removed. Colonizers bear responsibility for their actions that undermined native health, facilitated epidemic death, and inhibited recovery. So ask yourself, who's to blame? Thank you. Questions? Ben, do you want me to walk? Oh, okay, give one to Allison. She's right back by you.
If you do have any questions, please raise your hand, and I'll come to you to make sure that everybody can hear you and that we can pick you up on the recording.
Cool.
I was just wondering what the average lifespan was. You said women died of old age. I was just wondering if
Oh
you
yeah,
had
so
any idea.
in the pre-disease period, it was not uncommon for people to live to 80 or 90, which compared to, again, Europeans at the time is going to be decades longer, right? But then when you get to the period in Kansas, it's extremely compressed, right? Yeah. When we talked about Sarah and the missions in California, I mean, average age of death for children in there, if you're born in the mission, I think was like 6. I mean, it's an extremely compressed lifespan, yeah. Other questions? Yes.
So with all this in mind and what you just spoke about. Moving this to today, particularly, you look at reservations right now. They're like Pine Ridge Reservation, places like that, Standing Rock, about a year or two ago. What can we as students and scholars do to empower Indigenous communities and Indigenous people moving forward?
This is a question I almost never get. Well, first, if you live in Kansas, for example, Kansas is a state that has 4 reservation communities in it to the present, okay? Prairie Band, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Sac and Fox, Iowa. So that's unusual. A lot of states don't have any native reservation populations. What that means is our senators especially, but also our members in Congress, are often on some of the most influential committees that make decisions related to natives. So for example, the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. I think both of our senators are on it. So who you vote for in Kansas has outsized power in influencing native affairs, even if you're a non-native person, right? Another thing we have to do is, I don't know what kind of career path you're going into, but if you're going into education, for example, you've got to get your own brain decolonized, right? We are at an institution right now named for Johnson, in a county named for Johnson. Who the hell is Johnson? Johnson is a missionary slave-owning colonizer, right? So what do these structures even mean, right? Do we have any Shawnee, I think it's Shawnee Mission North students here, right? They have the native mascot, right? So native mascots are another thing a lot of native people are trying to change. So for example, why is that important? Because when you're a non-native person that meets a native person and they identify as Indigenous to you, the first thing you call to your mind all the things you know about native people. And unfortunately, if you're non-native, most of the things you know about natives are wrapped up in a Pocahontas Disney movie and mascots. And that limits who native people can be, because that's your stereotype. And when that's in an educational environment, like a mascot in a school, for example, we know there is overwhelming data that this limits the performance of children in those classrooms and limits who they think they can be, because the society has already limited the images of who they can be. So, I mean, and that's not the only example, right? Manhattan High School, I think it's Atchison High School. I think Atchison High School is the Red Men, if I'm right. So these are things that matter in terms of representation. You can also, of course, consume native-produced art and media. You can support native scholarship programs. You can provide service in native communities or to native organizations. Advocate for native people at our state level, at the federal level, right? And again, these are things that in Kansas we have some relative power to do. Yeah. Correct, right, and speaking of congressional delegations, yeah, I mean, you can literally, right, vote for native people in government. Yes, that's always an option, Chris. Yes.
So
yeah.
How does Sharice Davids, in the event that she wins, how does she find herself on one of these committees, and does she have the opportunity to if she's not, like, a state representative in the way that, like, a House member or a Senate member?
Right. Well, we would have, that usually is in terms of a hierarchical system inside of Congress, and Andrea might want to be the one that answers this, my colleague Andrea View, about what hierarchies lead to Indigenous representation on those committees. I think Sharice, if she got elected, would be the first Native woman ever elected to Congress, right? So I don't think your identity necessarily gets you inherently on a committee. In terms of being from Kansas, is she higher up on the list of being someone on said?
Sure, if we already have 2 members, would one of them, are both of those people Republicans right now? Or
Oh, well, so on the Senate one for Kansas, yes. The answer is yes. Now, I would argue, when it comes to Indian affairs at the governmental level, party is not a good indicator of who's going to be good or bad at this work. I mean, basically every president sucks at being good to Indians, right? Like, so you have to remember, you know, what policies are they specifically advocating for, and who are they listening to? Yeah, I think it usually works. Yeah, I think it usually works based on seniority. So there's less prominent lower level committees, and I think you do have some say. Like if they're like, well, you could be on this one, and you're like, that's horrible, I don't care. So for example, it's also in terms of interest in your district, right? So if Kansas has a district that has a lot of agriculture in it, they're gonna have more opportunity to be on committees that serve in that capacity. Yeah. David?
So colonization.
Yeah.
I'm just curious about the methods, and it doesn't seem as reactive. It's like more planning. I wonder, like, do you know where like that doctrine like originated? Like, I know, did it start with the Europeans or?
Yeah. Well, so in terms of how colonizing natives, yeah, we back up. I think there's a 15-something papal decree, I'd have to look it up in my book, when the Spanish and Portuguese are both colonizing in the Western Hemisphere, in the Caribbean and South America, they are competing over native land and native people to colonize. And so you have the Pope, right there, were both Catholic nations at the time, dividing up what territories they can control. And in so doing, they create something that, at least among Europeans, becomes a doctrine that they call the doctrine of discovery. So if you are the first Christian person to go to this space, you have first right to its ownership. And then once we get into the British and the French colonizing the Western Hemisphere, we have this doctrine of conquest or doctrine of physical possession. So you have to demonstrate some level of stable population on that land, which is why if we talk about the Louisiana Purchase, so we like to talk about Lewis and Clark on an expedition of discovery and neat, right? They're making maps. No, Jefferson was one of the most educated Americans on how the doctrine of discovery legally worked. And he knew that if the Americans wanted to possess that land, like all the way to the Columbia River on the northwest part of the continent, that Lewis and Clark had to do very specific documented things so that Americans could assert those doctrine of discovery rights, and they do it. So they specifically go to specific places. They document specific things so that at least in international European law, Americans can have claim to this land. And then once a so-called European power has claim to that land, the indigenous people in it are only allowed to sell that land, supposedly, to that claiming empire. So that's why Jefferson will do it in that way. Yeah, he is extremely well educated on the legal doctrine of the time, and he implements it with great intention to have this outcome. And he's also an extremely colonizing president. So natives lose more land while he's president than when Washington was president, which Washington was characterized as more aggressive in his colonization. But Jefferson is much more effective because he uses all kinds of different means. Yeah. Other questions? Let's go with can we go right behind you and then move forward? Yeah.
So going off what you just said on like the local level with our mascots, on a national level, why are the Redskins the Redskins?
Well, good question. Well, yeah, I think the short answer is money, right? I mean, the short answer is because of the way the sort of NFL monopoly works, there's no impetus to make it change. And I don't know if you've followed, there's been attempts actually to end the trademark because it was a racist trademark, and there are trademark rules that you can't have like a slandering trademark. And they won that at first, all right? So that meant that they could keep the mascot, but they can't make profit off of it. And in the NFL, they have profit sharing amongst teams. Right, so they thought that that might make the other owners of that team pressure him to change his trademark, which could then not be offensively indigenous. But I don't know if any of you followed this. There was a band called the Slants. They were an Asian American band. They named themselves that, and then they tried to register for a trademark, and it was declined because it was considered a racially offensive trademark, which they challenged all the way to the Supreme Court, and they won. And when they did that, it overturned the loss of the Redskins trademark. Yeah, which is why, so when that was happening, you have native activists who are like, what are you doing? Because if you win at this is going to impact us. And I've heard the guy who was the leader of that band who was part of that case talk about once it was over, he was going to advocate for indigenous rights and the end of mascots. And there's just, I mean, I haven't seen it, right? If it's happening, it's on a small scale. And that's how, again, so that's how a lot of these federal bureaucracies in which we relatively have a voice have a lot of impact on native issues, like pipelines. I think someone brought up pipelines, right? That's another great example where government wields a significant amount of power, in which we have some power, right? Oh, and then right in front of you, yeah. Oh, got it, okay. Other questions? No? Nothing. Oh, yes, way back.
They opened up the American Indian Museum of History or something in D.C.
Yes.
And that museum actually does a great job of kind of, I don't know if you say it's saying apologizing for America's history, but they do say like, we screwed everyone over with our contracts with the Indians. Like they do a really good job of kind of making a lot of stuff right. So I'd say that's a great place to go if you want to kind of find out more of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I would say two things about that. That's an excellent point. The National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. on the Mall, it's free. And by free, I mean your taxpayer dollars pay for it. So it's at no additional cost to you. it's actually native run, all right? It's native designed and native run, right? So when native people are in control of their own stories, their own history, their own data about their own health, all of these things, that is inherently going to be an act of decolonization. So absolutely right. And I would say, just on a note, I know Karen is back there, so I feel like I need to say this. You are on a campus with a contemporary art museum that is the only contemporary art museum, I believe, Karen, in a 4-state area, and it specializes in indigenous art. And because it's contemporary art, it's made by natives in the relative present. And that's natives portraying themselves. And that is a powerful act of decolonization, and you should see it. And frankly, as professors, right, we should incorporate that material into our classes where native people portray themselves and tell their own stories. Because another problem, and this goes back to your mascot questions, most of our image of who native people are is trapped in a dead past. And native people are alive and vibrant and more populous than even in the periods I've talked about here, all right? So colonization intended to eliminate, and it was not successful. And the only reason it was not successful is because native people were able to fight as a group against it, okay? It's not because Americans finally learned, shit, we should stop this, all right? It's because native people have made that resistance. And so I encourage anyone to go to the museum, yeah. Yeah, use that.
So then thinking about like classic American literature, like
Yeah.
The Last of the Mohicans, do you think that then
Oh,
should
God.
stop being taught?
Well, I think it should only be taught in a colonial myth context, right? You can still teach it, but you can be like, what's the gap between the way this is describing events and what was actually happening? And I think that's by James Fenimore Cooper, right? There's a lot of great scholarship by historians about his own personal baggage of his dad's own life that he manifested a romantic narrative of in all of his work. Well, once you know that, you're like, oh, no wonder it's full of crap. I get it now, right? But those images, I think the problem is Americans who are non-native consume pop culture about natives as if it is historically teaching. It's not, right? Yes.
So, on the topic of books, how is it legal that a lot of books, textbooks specifically, are labeled as nonfiction and can essentially rewrite history, not only like Japanese
Internment.
internment,
right.
but
Right.
in relation to colonization and stuff like this? And so, up until college, some of us, a lot of us potentially didn't know
Right.
that
Me
this
too.
is is in theory the truth.
Right. Right. Or at least colonialism is a structure and it's,
Absolutely.
implemented and intended. Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of things there. Is that colonial hierarchy still manifesting in our real lives? I would say yes.
Yes.
Second, who has access to create content that is widely consumed? Well, so what I'm arguing is native authors who are writing their own stuff, and they are writing their own stuff. There are loads of Osage scholars writing their own history, and they have been for over a century. The problem is someone writes Killers of the Flower Moon about native death in the oil boom, which is about the Osage, and that book gets its movie rights bought, right? Like, maybe you should have bought the movie rights to the native scholar who wrote about that 50 years ago, talking about his mother and his grandmother who died in that situation, instead of privileging the content that comes from outside the community. Now, I should say, I'm not native, and I wrote a book about the Osage, right? I wrote an article about the Osage, and I am, frankly, not yet convinced that I'm not engaging in colonial hierarchies and telling this history, right? I mean, what does it mean for me to be doing this work? And maybe it's fraught, and maybe I shouldn't have done it, right? But you've got to think about what your role is in that hierarchy, and what does access mean, right? So we're at a college. Access to our classrooms, access to higher education, access to employment here. Those are all things that we have to think about if we're really going to decolonize. And that doesn't just apply to indigenous people. That applies to all levels of colonization. Slavery was a system of colonization, right? These are all parts of the same structure. Other questions? Yes? No, the Shawnee mission was for the Shawnee. Yeah, the Shawnee mission is for the Shawnee people. They were Atlantic Coast people. So they're a great example of these refugees, right? And if you know about Tecumseh, right, he's a famous Shawnee man who resists the United States. And if you ever can read his writings, I mean, he lays it all out. He's like, they've pushed us from the coast to Ohio and Indiana. They will not rest till we're dead. They're going to divide and conquer us. They're going to push us. And he's right. I mean, everything he says about that is exactly what policy was intending to implement. And he sees it, right, in his own life, and he dies for it. He dies trying to resist it. I mean, and that's another thing you can talk about with Native resistance. Why is it that the team in Washington has a Native warrior as their mascot? Why isn't it a farming Native woman? Is it because we associate aggressive, primitive war in caricature with Natives, right? Like, so even these stereotypes. So like the Shawnee Mission, for example. I mean, a lot of times when I talk to my students about the Shawnee Mission, they don't get that it's like the Shawnee Indians and a mission to assimilate and eliminate them. And then they're expelled from Kansas to what we would now call Oklahoma, which is how Johnson is compensated for his effort missionizing them with the land that becomes this county. And that's why we name it for him. And he was a slave owner. He was a pro-slavery representative in the territorial Kansas government. I mean, so Indians are in everything that is Kansas, right? Our political structures, the names of our counties. You know, we can't forget, but we can't remember, right? Yes.
Where do we draw the line between freedom of speech and like right to assemble in terms of religious people and going on missions to like talk about how they feel as Christians or Jewish people or whatever in other countries or even in regions of the United States where the idea may not necessarily be, oh, I want to completely wipe this out. It's, I want you to feel how I feel.
Right.
So where do we draw the line to say this isn't okay?
Well, I think a couple of things to think about, there are layers there. One, am I an unwilling agent of colonialism? And once I become aware of that, how do I feel about that? Because this wasn't a religious mission. This was a political and economic mission. And there's whole books. There's an Osage scholar who's written about missionary conquest, and he argues they are agents in imperialism. But he says they didn't really intend that. Like, their intent is not genocide. But they believe inherently that the people's belief, Osage beliefs, are inferior, right? And thus need to be changed. We are bringing you up to us. Well, you might want to ask if they feel like they need to be brought up, right? And the irony in the Osage case is they were so devout in their spiritual practices that the Protestant missionaries in particular are like, we wish our Protestant white neighbors were this committed to their spiritual practices or things would be a lot better, right? So the question is in missionization, do people want your gift, right? And once they get it, what does that mean, right? Is that an effort to eliminate? Is it an effort to culturally eliminate, culturally colonize? Is this the beginning of a larger political and economic effort? You know, what am I a tool of, and do I accept that? And I think there's a difference between service and missionization, right? So people that provide service, even if it's in their own mind as part of their religious belief, is different than your belief and culture is inferior, you're going to hell, and good news, I'm here, and I'm gonna fix it, right? There is a patronizing logic to that you have to wrestle with.
Yeah, well, we aren't allowed to put any restrictions on our missionary activities. However, in outreach to other people, if we do the outreach appropriately, the first thing we ask is what those people aspire to and how we can collaborate them within their cultural values and their objectives to achieve that in a way that it's culturally acceptable to them. And virtually no development organization does that.
Right, well, that's one option, right? I mean, we have to remember, well, according to Chris, yeah. Asterisk. Any other questions? No? Well, it's about time that you're all going to have to run off to your next class. So thank you for coming, and I appreciate it.